Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We have with us today Paul Williams from the very famous and very fast growing blogging theology channel. He's a Muslim intellectual as well as well read in the Western canon. He's an ex Catholic. Would you be a lapsed Catholic in this case? Would that be the.
Oh, no, I was very much. Oh, assalamu alaikum, by the way.
Wa
Thank you
alaikum
very
salam.
much for your very kind invitation to come on your channel today. It's a great privilege. And yeah, I know I wasn't allowed. No. Just before I said my shahada, I was very much committed Catholic. Went to church regularly, very interested in the sacraments and the church, the teaching of the church. So no, I was definitely not lapsed.
No, sorry, I would. I don't understand the idea of the lapsed Catholic. Is the idea that it's somebody who's still a Catholic but not very interested in the church anymore? Is that
That's right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah, on the eve of my conversion to Islam, I wasn't in any way a lapsed Christian. I was very interested in
Wow.
my faith as a Christian, but which made my the arrival of Islam in my life quite a powerful challenge and dilemma for me. So, which I wrestle with for some time.
No, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very straightforward sort of line of questioning. More often than not, with a lot of converts or reverts. That when was the moment? When did you see the light? Or I suspect it was a more gradual process. I mean, what I would be more interested in is when was the first time you were cognizant of the fact that there is another religion, another Abrahamic or monotheistic faith, Islam, maybe in school, maybe outside of school, maybe you met Muslims, considering London is very cosmopolitan and the UK in general has a sizable Muslim
No,
population.
I always looked at Islam as this remote, foreign, other religion that had absolutely no relevance to my life whatsoever, except, this is speaking now from my Christian past, I saw it as a threat.
Right.
By threat, I mean as a competitor religion on the world stage. So Islam, like Christianity, are both missionary religions, they're proselytizing religions, they're both looking for converts, of course. So I saw it as a major threat and competitor in the UK, and I found that troubling, to be honest. And that's how I viewed it for a long time, until I decided one day to actually look at the religion more closely, and that's when my journey began. But there was no bright light or flashing light or Damascus Road experience. It was a process over time, which only at the end resulted in conversion, of course. And I didn't seek to become a Muslim at all. That was never my agenda. Why would I want to become a Muslim? I thought, So it was only when I investigated it, read the Quran, read the Seerah, and discovered real Islam that I suddenly realized there was a parallel faith that was deep and rich and amazing and God-given, really, as my Christian faith was. And that's how I saw it. And that's when the dilemma really, I was in a fork in the road. Do I continue as a Christian Catholic, or do I embrace Islam? That was the challenge. And then it became really a cultural issue, because even though I became convinced that Muhammad, upon whom be peace, was a prophet sent by God, that was the easy bit, really. The difficult bit was the civilizational consequences of embracing Islam, because being part of the white middle class majority here in the UK, and then leaving that in some ways and joining a minority culturally and otherwise in the UK, a minority that's often misunderstood, even despised by some people. That I was also being, in a way, asked to embrace that too, that identity, or joining that group. Although not leaving my other group as well. It's a complicated binary there.
I suspect you get to maintain your white identity, but you're also expected to develop a tolerance for spices.
Yeah, I did. I was called a traitor, of course. I still am, by some white people. I mean, that's kind of, expected. I get that quite often. But it wasn't just a cultural thing. It was actually it was crossing an invisible civilizational line from the dominant hegemonic kind of group to the non. And we see this, for example, over Palestine, what's happening with Gaza at the moment. I think if I'd remained a conservative Christian, I would have naturally, as people do in America and Britain and Europe, have been pro-Zionist, God forbid. But crossing over that invisible line, I suddenly saw the world through the eyes of the global South, as it's called sometimes. Through the eyes of the Palestinians, through the eyes of brown people, Muslims, Arabs. And that's something I never did as a Christian. Christians just don't do that in the West, anyway. So I could begin to see the world through the perspective of the dispossessed, those who suffer as a consequence of Western military aggression, occupation, colonialism, imperialism. And of course, this is common sense to you and virtually most people on the planet, but I had to learn that lesson for myself, really, seeing things from a different point of view.
Did you? I can understand your experience of, and it's not something that you should be ashamed of, because I mean, that's how you grew up and that's what you experienced, and it is a completely different experience, and one does experience a sort of qualia when thinking about the Muslim experience in the UK or in the world in general, and it comes as a big shock, I suspect, that maybe a lot of institutions and things that you might have found to be sacred and secure and things that made you feel comfortable, like the military and these sorts of, it meant a lot of, a lot of massacre and a horrible experience for a lot of other people. But that's neither here nor there. Did you grow up with the sense of that Islam is also a violent threat, like with Spain, with Moorish Spain, and the Turks are at the gates of Constantinople? Considering you had a very serious, a deep-rooted Christian identity, did you the medieval history between Islam and the Christian West, was that something that affected
Not
you?
really. No, I think I was very, very ignorant, actually, even more ignorant than I am now, if that's conceivable. And I didn't really know anything about Islamic Spain. I didn't know anything about Andalusia, that's for sure. The gates of Vienna and all that. No, I didn't know about that. Well, I knew about 9/11. 9/11,
Wow.
of course. That was the big watershed moment for people in the West. This the so-called war and terror that came about as a result of that attack. And and of course the drip feed from the media about militant Muslims and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so on. There was a sense that the Muslims were, when politically active, were quote unquote militant. I mean, I don't subscribe to any of this narrative now, of course, but I'm just trying to recreate how I saw it. So, and as a threat to me as a Christian, for sure, because as I said, they were a competitor, taking away people from Christianity. But also as the other, so that they were identify them as with the immigrant population rather than what I then saw it as the British population. I know it's different from that, but so it was a mixture of immigration, fear of the other, and the whole issue of terrorism and violence which was associated in the minds of many in the West with Islam. So I had to unlearn all of that when I looked into this, and of course the realities are very, very different from what I've described. Of course, the realities couldn't be more different. The West is the one that is occupying and killing and justifying genocide on an unimaginable scale, and it's hard to think that how one could not see that. It's very obvious to most people on the planet, but it wasn't obvious to me then. But alhamdulillah, it is now. But yeah.
No, alhamdulillah, yeah. We're glad that Allah has chosen you for His deen, and this is a great honor considering that we get this by birthright, and we make no effort for this. People like you, mashallah, you've made the effort, and Allah will reward you. He's granted you hidayah because you're somebody who...
His grace, He chooses whom He will. It's not to do with my merits. He chooses whom He will, and many of us are not worthy to be used by Him, but He has His purposes. Not always clear what they are, at least not to me. But alhamdulillah, He's blessed me with that experience of the true understanding of Islam and other things as well. And it's a great gift.
May Allah bless you for your humility. I suspect that you are a God-fearing man, and Allah chooses the people of taqwa. Maybe that's one of the few merits that Allah makes one worthy for grace. But considering that you grew up in the 80s, am I right?
Sorry.
Considering that you grew up in the 80s, yes?
Oh, I see. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
you grew
Yes.
up in the
Yes.
80s, and that was a time when you had massive immigration from South Asia, from the Muslim community specifically, in the UK. You didn't interact with them maybe in high school, in public school, in at work. Did you ever or is it just always on the periphery, and you were very busy with your life and your
Oh,
lifestyle?
I did at work. Yeah, I remember in one of my early jobs when I was a civil servant. I remember in my section there were a number of Muslim ladies who I was in an office, and I remember I haven't remembered this for some time, but I remember I approached one of them and asked her more about Islam. But my reason for wanting to know more about Islam is so I can convert Muslims to Christianity. And she quickly worked out that that was my agenda, that I wasn't sincere at all. And she basically stopped talking to me about it. So she guessed that I was just trying to use her for information about it. I mean, I could have found the information out anywhere else in books, but so yeah, I did know Muslims at work, but I saw them as people who one would convert to Christianity, rather than as people I would learn sincerely from.
Have you since reconnected with that ex-colleague?
Oh no, that was a long time ago. No. She was never a friend or anything, but she no. That water's passed long
I'm
ago.
very sorry to hear. I hope she can see you online somewhere, and she can smile with the fact maybe she gave you a dua. Maybe she gave you a dua.
Yeah. Well, maybe her prayers. Maybe if she was praying for me, yeah, maybe exactly. Who knows?
Who knows? Right. So your experience with Islam is peripheral at best. You see them as people who live in the UK, maybe not as fully British. You don't have that sort of medieval or Constantinople and then the threat of the Turks and the Arabs in Spain. It's more of a post 9/11 reality. And prior to 9/11, you were very ignorant of them, and you were like, this is another peripheral religion. Did you grow up, and considering you were in a middle class family, there was a lot of, I'm sure, national pride, and did your family and you respect the institution of the crown? Maybe that was a very important.
I don't know. This thing about national pride is not very common in Britain, actually. Really, some people have it a lot. No, I wasn't brought up in an especially nationalistic or patriotic family at all. The crown, yeah, I mean, we weren't pro-monarchy or anti-monarchy. It was pretty much irrelevant. I mean, most British people then and now, I think, are secular, not really engaged with things. They were quite disengaged with institutions, whether it be the government. Most of us, of course, are very unhappy with the government. That's nothing new, I suppose. I guess many people are still pro-monarchy, but for many people, it's irrelevant or not interesting. So no, we weren't particularly passionate about anything really like that. It was more local issues to do with the immediate environment than identifying with national institutions, anything like that.
Right. So considering you were like mildly sort of locally, you had national pride maybe in your local football team, at the pub, with your friends, in your church, with your abbey, whatever it was. Did that identity ever have any negative or aggressive ideas about the Muslims post 9/11, where you saw them as a more violent threat other than just a competing faith? Did you feel yourself?
Yeah. Well, when I became a Christian in my early 20s, and I think, there was certainly an awareness of Muslims as a threat. In fact, one of the main threats to Christianity, and the other being secularism or secular liberalism, which is a threat to Christianity. This is true. And perhaps capitalism, the sense of this kind of consumer capitalism, which this obsession with dunya and possessions. So I think those are the three main threats, or the couple of threats: Islam, the intellectual, ideological challenge of secular liberalism, and the kind of selfish, materialistic, capitalistic kind of system we all live with. So I think those were the main. So Islam was the main religious enemy, for sure.
And what started to appeal to you about Islam, where you wanted to study it in a more academic way, other than just wanting to convert people?
It didn't appeal. That wasn't the
All
issue.
right.
It had no appeal at all. It was just an interest. I wanted to learn. I was curious. I'm still am very curious about things. So I realized how little I knew about Islam, and I thought it was about time. I thought that I read the Quran because obviously it's the book of the Muslim. So I literally went out and bought an English translation. A dreadful one, it turns out. But anyway, and I read it from cover to cover in English. I remember going in lunchtime, sitting in my local church, funnily enough, and reading it because it was a quiet space, and just reading through a bit of the Quran every day, and simply with the objective of reading every page of it. So I just simply wanted to have said, I could say to people, I have read the Quran from cover to cover. And of course, I wasn't reading the Quran. I was reading an English translation, not a very good one either, but hey. And that was my introduction to Islam, purely as a sort of a curiosity to better educate myself about this religion called Islam. It was no more or less than that, really. But nevertheless, it did start me on a journey. I remember I also, at the same time, bought my first ever book on Islam by a guy called Guy Eaton. He was an English writer. He was a diplomat. He was a convert to Islam. He had been a Muslim 50 years, but at the time of his death, several years ago. And I remember this is the book I got, Islam and the Destiny of Man by Guy Eaton. And I still recommend it today. It's a phenomenal, extraordinary work, a beautifully written book, explaining the Islamic worldview, written by an Englishman, but very much someone who has lived within Islam for many, many years at a very deep level. And reading that book completely changed my understanding. And I suddenly realized I was dealing with a faith that was as deep and rich and spiritual and amazing as the best in Christianity. By the best in Christianity, I mean, I'd really appreciated people like St. Augustine in the 5th century AD, his book, The Confessions, as it's called, The City of God. He was an amazing intellect, fantastic spiritual writer, hugely influential in the Middle Ages. Thomas à Kempis in the 14th, 15th century, a German mystic. He wrote The Imitation of Christ. This is often seen as the most popular Christian book after the Bible. In terms of, Christians, he was a monk in Kempen in Germany, and he wrote this extraordinary work about Jesus and about spirituality. And I mentioned those two, just one of many. That what I discovered through Guy Eaton was that Islam had a parallel tradition, which was as deep and amazing as Christianity. And for me, that was mind-blowing. That was a paradigm shift. I mean, wow. So Christianity isn't the only show in town. There could be another tradition that God has clearly spoken through or breathed his truth and grace into in a powerful way. And that was really shocking. And because of my very limited fundamentalist worldview, I had no idea about this. And so it stopped being just a curiosity. Well, I must simply read the Quran to say I've done it, to acquire some knowledge about Islam, and then I move on. It stopped being just that. It became a spiritual journey for me that suddenly, in a different way. So I carried on being a Christian, but also started to explore real Islam spiritually at a deep level. And that's when the adventure began, really.
MashaAllah. Were you into the polemic sort of very did you know the sort of the common Orientalist sort of criticisms of Islam or the Prophet or any of the literary criticisms of the Quran? Okay, so those were not things you were dealing with. Were you finding
not at all.
No. Were you finding problems with the Quran while you were reading it? Like, would you say, aha, I figured it out. Here's those hidden verses that was there any of those moments? Did you feel like you
Not
wrestled
really.
with anything?
Not with the Quran. I mean, yeah, later on there was one or two verses which, for a Western secular person, inevitably, who's been accepting a liberal worldview, inevitably there are going to be issues. Although I had encountered similar issues in the Bible, by the way. So I sometime before in the New Testament, if you read the Bible, say, as a person who's brought up in the West with secular liberal values, you're going to come across passages in the New Testament which are going to be problematic about slavery, because the New Testament supports slavery, or the position and role of women vis-a-vis men, and so on. And there are one or two verses in the Bible and the Quran like that, but they struck me as very kind of relatively small compared to the overall message. So I wasn't unduly shocked by the Quran. The Quran struck me then, it still does, of course, but as coming with the authority, speaking with the authority and power of God, and that sense of spiritual power is very palpable, and that's what impressed me most in reading the Quran.
Right. So some of the more, I feel like this is a common problem that people find. Some of the more legal aspects of the Quran and the Bible, they find the legal prescriptions maybe, and sometimes in the treatment of certain categories of human, and you reconcile that maybe initially with the magnanimity of the whole message, and maybe these are little nitpicks. And
I wasn't concerned with those issues at the first stage. I mean, I wasn't going to convert to Islam. It didn't matter to me if the Quran, had verses about women which, like 434, for example, Surah 4, verse. It didn't really matter because I wasn't. So what?
But was that a gotcha? Was that a gotcha for you to help convert Muslims, or was that something that when you went, aha, I found it, or it was something that you thought was insignificant?
So what was the question again? I didn't quite understand.
Those kinds of verses, even though you weren't concerned with Islam as a theology because you weren't interested in it personally.
Exactly, I wasn't. I mean, there are problematic verses in the New Testament. So, I mean, I was aware the Quran was coming from a different world. I mean, I didn't expect it to sound like something produced by the BBC. I mean, it's coming from a different world. So no, I wasn't in any way fazed because it simply wasn't an issue for me. I wasn't a Muslim.
But was that an aha sort of gotcha moment for you, where you were like, I need this to, or did you find that because the Bible has similar, you just sort of skimmed through these things?
Oh yeah. No. I mean, much of the Quran, it was very familiar to me because, I'd read the prophets in the Christian Bible. So, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Micah, Moses, etc., etc. The message was similar, particularly the smaller, the shorter surahs at the back.
There's a common.
It's not. It wasn't. Oh my goodness, this is a very strange book. It wasn't like that. It was. A lot of it was familiar. I mean, there's a lot of the apocalyptic, the Meccan surahs are quite apocalyptic or eschatological. This was very familiar to me from the Bible. So it was like, oh, really? It's here too.
There's a critique that I get from some Christian brothers and sisters sometimes, where they find that the Quranic treatment of the prophets is sort of a rewriting of the real history of the prophets. Did you ever think that as a Christian, that the treatment of the prophets here is a bit different or odd, or did you find it problematic, or did you like it? For example, maybe you thought the prophets were, as they are, more dignified in the Quran.
Well, they are. I mean, yeah, the prophets often the prophets in the Bible, unfortunately, are portrayed as quite immoral, evil people, even, without going into all the details. Where the Quran saves them from such slander, and that they are portrayed as prophets of God, of course. So, this is now, as how I see it now, but the Quran corrects the biblical narrative sometimes when it misrepresents the past or historical events or the prophets. But so, again, these are later questions. When I was reading the Quran for the very first time, I didn't go into that kind of level of detail. It was just finding out what the Quran was saying about anything at all. I had to go back and reread it again and again before I investigated some of these comparisons. I was aware there were some differences, like Ishmael and Isaac and all the rest of it, but these were not very important to me and didn't really matter actually to me. I wasn't interested in sorting them out.
To quote Western literature, did you feel like it was a Socratic rewriting of the Homeric heroes, a little bit, like a little tricky sort of, to make more moral versions of these? You didn't find that? Because that's it
struck me as a Semitic text in the sense that, I mentioned, the Jewish prophets. We're dealing with a voice from God that considerably overlap with what I was already familiar with in the Bible.
No, you misheard my question. I mean, did you find it to be like a Socratic sort of, rewriting of Homeric heroes with the prophets? Because that's a criticism. You didn't.
I don't understand what that means. That question, no.
So in the Republic, Socrates argues that he needs to recreate the Homeric heroes because they weren't moral men, and they need to be recreated in a moral image, and for to make to create the Socratic hero.
That thought never crossed my mind.
Okay, maybe.
Actually, no, I was much more superficial than that. I was just getting a very rough sense of what the Quran was about in a very basic way. I had no knowledge of it at all. Oh, they believe in one God. Is that level? It wasn't like, is it a Socratic rereading of the Homeric epics? No, that's a kind of PhD level. This is much more basic. It was, I can't stress how basic my ignorance was and how entry level my acquaintance became. Obviously, what you're saying, I understand what you're saying now, but that wasn't something that crossed my mind. No. But also that there is also the sense, by the way, that and this is often overlooked, but it's always overlooked by Christians really, who don't know the Bible well, is the Bible itself does this. 1 and 2 Chronicles in the Jewish Bible rewrite the story of some of the earlier Jewish Israeli leaders and prophets, and to use your language, whitewashes them. It presents David, for example, as a noble king, whereas in other stories, like in the king's narratives, he's presented as, quite frankly, as a sinner. So even in the Quran is following one biblical tradition rather than another, if you like, in presenting them in a positive way. But this is not a Quranic invention. The Bible itself does this as well. It actually corrects its own bad retelling of how the prophets are portrayed in 1 or 2 Chronicles. Now, this is well recognized by scholars. This is not my idea. I mean, I discovered this through reading them, but the Bible itself wrestles with this problem and comes to the view, at least in the Chronicles, that they are actually noble prophets of God over against other portrayals in the Bible, because the Bible is a library of books written by many people over 1,000 years, not a single author. So it actually corrects it. The Bible does that. And the Quran, I think, would agree with Chronicles over against other portrayals in Kings and Samuel and so on. But were you aware of that?
Pardon?
Were you aware of that the Bible itself does that?
No, that was a new. I was waiting for you to finish your point. Yeah. That was a very new idea for me, because I had assumed that the narrative was linear in the sense of that,
No.
That there's
no. There are, because again, we must understand the Bible as I say, a library of books written by different people, different authors, different times, with different perspectives. We get this in the New Testament as well. Not everyone agrees in the New Testament about how to portray Jesus and who he was and his understanding of the law and so on. There's differences of opinion, different perspectives in the New Testament about Jesus, different views. Ditto in the Jewish Bible about the prophets. So, and this is something that critical scholarship has uncovered, because it pays attention to the particular voice of each chapter of each writer. It doesn't try and homogenize everything into a kind of mono narrative. And if you do that, there's some startling results. I mentioned 1 or 2 Chronicles. I mean, what people can look this up for themselves. It deliberately writes the story of the prophets in a much more positive way.
Right. Okay.
It's compatible with the Quran. So this idea is not new to the Quran. It's found in the Bible itself. You have a positive portrayal of David and others in Chronicles over against other writers who have a negative view. So Christians can't just say, oh, well, we have a much more whatever in the Bible and you Muslims do X, because the Bible itself does that, what the Quran is doing.
The Bible itself is in conflict with it. Right.
Exactly. So the Quran then is this is obviously me saying that's not the Quran. The Quran is endorsing or affirming that portrayal of the prophets, even in the Bible, which is more positive and more wholesome and more moral than the decadent portrayal and egregious portrayal of some of the prophets in the Bible.
Yes.
So the Bible itself has different voices. It has different portrayals.
Now, culturally, I also felt this, that when we said prophet and when Christian says a prophet, the meaning is is, it's chalk and cheese, because when we say prophet, it's like immediately, you're very attentive, and, a prophet said this, or a prophet did such and such. I think it has much higher stakes for the Muslim world, and I suspect that's one of those things that maybe that you could help teach the Christian brothers and sisters, that that sort of sanctimonious or sacred position of the prophets is the correct understanding of how these
Yeah, well,
these
it's
great
there in
leaders
the
were.
Christian Bible. I mean, again, it's not a Muslim view. It's also so for Jews, for the Israelites, particularly, the greatest figure of all was Moses and Abraham. But Moses are preeminently because he's the lawgiver,
Yes.
and he was a prophet. And the four books, the Pentateuch, are the books of Moses, not the books of Abraham. So that this very high esteem given to Moses above all the other prophets, because there are many other prophets, of course, in the Jewish Bible, but he was the lawgiver. He gave the Torah, Mount Sinai, the 613 commandments of the law. So he has that very high status, which Muslims would obviously relate to and agree with. It's Christians who have fallen away from that and somehow degraded or downgraded prophethood to something almost, who cares, and that's a shame. So Christians can learn from the Israelites, from their own Bible's portrayal of the high status given to prophets. Prophets ruled Israel. They weren't just guys who they had power. Some of them were anointed. They were like messiahs. They were very, very important men, and not just men. There were some who were female too. But so it's Christians who have downgraded this because they have overpraised, exaggerated praise of Jesus. And so everything else has become distorted. It's become out of balance. And Islam restores the balance.
Right. It is the middle path, right?
Exactly.
And did you find the theological positions in the Quran to be appealing? What started to attract you to the Quran or to Islam? Surely, was it the convert of the Muslims? Was it people you met, or was it just you and your journey with this book? Or did you start reading supplementary books as well?
Well, as I mentioned, Islam and the Destiny of Man,
that,
and other books written by him. Yeah, I did start to read more widely as I abandoned my initial limited project of simply reading the Quran and then moving on with my life. I realized there was an awful lot more to discover, as indeed there is. So no, I think the Tawheed, the unity and oneness of God, was very powerful, clearly, and that again was not new. It's there in the Bible, but it's affirmed, restated in a particularly powerful way in the Quran and the Islamic tradition, in the Hadith, obviously. So that was very interesting, and also fairly quickly, I was able to connect what I knew about Jesus, the historical Jesus, what I knew from academically from in Western studies about Jesus, and what the Quran says about Jesus. And fairly quickly, I noticed that there was a great convergence, a similarity, a concurrence between the two, and that was interesting. And that enabled me in a way to, because I was a Trinitarian, I believed Jesus was God, but I was fairly quickly able to see that I could still be potentially have a very deep a deep commitment to a spiritual tradition, to God, and so on, without being a Trinitarian. That I could have a relationship with God, as I would put it, without having to believe in the incarnation or the Trinity, but also accepting the fruits of historical research when it comes to the Gospels and the historical Jesus. So I realized there was a new kind of synthesis possible, which had never occurred to me before.
And so reimagining the position that Christ had in your life, where at once he was somebody that you would call out to in prayer, and that you would centralize him as a figure, as being part of a triune God. Was that very difficult or a heavy burden emotionally, spiritually, or did you find it to be a very easy transition via the Quran? That because it's a kind of you're taking away the status of divinity to a prophethood, or him just being a messiah. Was that something easy? Was that comfortable for you Did you have problems reconciling
It
that?
was.
Mashallah.
Well, once I saw that my worship of Jesus and my church's worship of Jesus was pure idolatry, which it is, and thus a great sin, I quickly stopped. But my worship of God didn't stop, and I remember thinking when I started to practice Islamically before my conversion as a shahada, before I said the shahada, I started to operate privately, more Islamically. I remember thinking, well, the prayers that Muslims pray, my experience of prayer as I began to experience as a Muslim was very similar to my experience as a Christian, actually. At its best, I'm not saying that the idolatry was, but praying to God, the sense of God being God Almighty, all powerful, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, and so on. I could relate to all that as a Christian because it
Like,
is found in Christianity.
would you use a prayer book to pray, like to read like a transliteration or something?
Um, I think when I prayed, I did prostration. No, it was I didn't pray properly like a Muslim. I didn't know how to do it for a start. But what I meant was theologically and spiritually. I
Right.
dropped praying to a Trinity. I started praying to God alone. I did prostration, so I stopped, praying like a Christian, and it was a gradual shift in orientation.
Did
Uh,
that did the sajda, did the feeling of making sajda, was that instinctual and like an innate human sort of, did it feel
Oh,
good,
yeah,
right?
it was, and it was very liberating
Right.
and very natural. And I was very aware that it connected with how the prophets
So
are portrayed as praying in the Bible. Again, it's not new, um, but something that uh, even though it's not new, it's something that I focused on anew and realized it was part of a Jewish/Christian tradition as well. Although it's been largely forgotten now, I think, amongst Christians, but it's there in the Bible.
So you mentioned at the start of the conversation that, mashallah, you were convinced very early on, before your shahada, that Rasulullah is a messenger of God, and Yani
Hmm.
Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And did you end up reading any of the Sirah? Was that something that you,
Yeah, but that
was
was
it
the
the
other great.
Quran or the other
Yeah,
way?
no, it was the Quran first, of course, and then I discovered the second great, astonishing reality of Islam, which I knew absolutely nothing about, to my shame, really, which was the Seerah of Muhammad, upon whom be peace. And I remember reading an amazing book about the Seerah by Martin Lings, a
Yes.
great British writer.
Yeah.
And that reading that book really what was an extraordinary experience. And I've read it several times since, and I do recommend it to people. I mean, this book is a great biography, and the only reason I think that it's not much more highly regarded as a great biography of a figure in the English language, in English literature, of all English literature, the reason it's not doesn't have a very high standing as a great work of biography is because of its subject, because it's about Muhammad. Because the book is an extraordinary work of art.
Yeah, from a literary standpoint, 100%. It's
It
creating,
is, and I think I would say the only reason it's not given the credit it's due is because of who it's about, and the prejudice or the lack of engagement with its subject. So it's not an easy read because he writes at a very eloquent level, but it is nevertheless an astonishing book. So, but moving beyond Martin Ling's artistry as a biography, the subject itself was extraordinary, and learning about the Prophet Muhammad upon his life was a revelation, and suddenly I began to understand Islam a bit better. So the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet, God and his Prophet, suddenly became much more in focus than it had before. And also, I was just aware of how ignorant we are in the West about this individual, and he really should be. much better known in the West than he is, and it is terrible that he's been ignored because on any level he is a surpassing individual. Just on a purely human level, he was an extraordinary general. He was extraordinary head of state, a military commander. He was an amazing father to his people. He was an incredible leader, a leader of men. He was a prophet, of course. He was on every level, social, political, spiritual, religious. He was incredibly successful in a way that is unparalleled in history. Yes, there are brilliant people who were very, very successful, like Napoleon, Caesar. Yeah, as military strategists, absolutely. Napoleon was brilliant, a military guy. But Napoleon was none of the other things. He wasn't, he wasn't a spiritual leader,
Yes.
far from it. So Muhammad, upon him be peace, embodies all of these many roles to a superlative degree, which is, as I say, unknown, unparalleled in human history. And that was obviously quite a discovery.
Even from an academic perspective, I think you've struck a nerve there that in general, like the European academic culture, as just a subject of history, Rasulullah is unfortunately ignored, and I suspect that's
Yes.
by design. It's very purposeful.
It is. I mean, to give a silly example, I don't mean disrespectfully, but Netflix. Yes, I do watch Netflix. And there are lots of documentaries there about great generals in history, great commanders, great conquests. You get videos about documentaries about Alexander the Great or Napoleon, all that. There's nothing anywhere about the Prophet of Islam at all. Now, I'm not saying there should be or shouldn't be, but he is completely ignored. But other great commanders and influential figures, anyone you choose, Gandhi, lots of things about Hitler. They're obsessed about Hitler for some reason. I mentioned Napoleon and Alexander the Great and so on. But Muhammad and Islam is completely absent from anything on Netflix. Now, there may be whatever reasons are, but this is not just Netflix. This is everything. Where you go on other, big cable internet channels, there's nothing about Islam or Muhammad at all, except you might get the odd mention about, the Iraq War or the Taliban or something. You get these kind of, Orientalist kind of Western perspectives about that, but nothing about Islam really at all. And so this ignorance that I inherited continues in 2024.
No.
We still don't engage seriously with a religion that will soon be the largest religion on the planet within
Inshallah.
50 years.
And I think
And what do we know about it? We know nothing about it in the West. It's just it's shocking. And that's deliberate. If it was just Netflix, oh, well, that's just them.
Gee, we're back.
Yeah, we're back. I can hear you.
Yeah. So no, it's completely understandable that your frustration now, mashallah, that you're a Muslim and that you're much more well read on these subjects, and this ignorance that you talked about that is inherited. It's not true for Paul Williams anymore, alhamdulillah, and you should be.
No, and this is part. This is because of this extraordinary discovery for me that I've being by the grace of God allowed to have this discovery. I'm very keen to share it with others, and that's what I do on blogging theology. Is to some extent, share this discovery with other people, because it's very important.
Silly little anecdote like Netflix. No anecdote is silly. The way I was introduced to you was your beautiful shorts that you would make in nature, walking around in a park or doing something, and you would mention just a simple hadith about theology, about God, or something.
Yeah.
And I thought that was beautiful, very touching. It was very moving. And I found it to be, at first I thought you were just some, professor character interested in Islamic theology. I had no idea about your journey, mashallah. And I thought it was very beautiful. And I used to watch those and I used to say, who is this sweet old, white man?
There's a strange white guy.
No, not strange in the least, mashallah.
In the countryside saying these things.
No, they would be lovely.
Exactly.
They would be very lovely. They would pick me up, some days. So, at what age were you convinced that it's time for you to take the Shahada? Was it in your 30s, late, or 40s?
It'd been about 50, without going to my exact chronology, it was about 15, 16, 17 years ago, I think, from the very beginning. But it was a process. It was never a one day it was like this and everything changed. It was definitely something that took place incrementally, slowly, month by month.
Right.
Yeah.
And you slowly replaced your diet of fish and chips and the biryani and the more spicy things. Even though, don't get me wrong, don't knock it on. I love fish and chips. I love the English fish and chips.
I should hope so. It's our great gift to the world,
It
fish and
is.
chips.
And mushy peas. I love mushy peas.
No. I draw the line at mushy peas. I'm sorry. I don't necessarily. I'm not an uncritical admirer, but
I feel like now you're going to say that chocolate digestives aren't good. I feel like that's what you're going to come up with.
Another great gift to the world. Yes, chocolate dishes are excellent. So I do recommend that. Yeah, we could go down that path of biscuits and food. Yeah, quite a lot.
Why
there's
the
some good
mushy
stuff.
peas? Why the opposition of the mushy peas? The consistency?
Mushy. What? We need the peas in there, as they are. We don't need them crushed and smashed to pieces. We just need them just gently cooked and add to the fish. Yeah, I'm not anti-pea, by the way. I'm not anti-pea. I'm just smashing them to pieces. It's like this. I once went to a place and they had crushed avocado, and I'm thinking, what are you doing to these avocados? You're crushing them to death. Just let them be. Sorry, this is a silly conversation.
It's a lovely conversation. Just mentioning the culinary delights. Have you partaken in the sort of the Central Asian, South Asian, or Middle Eastern cuisine yet? Any of the African cuisines?
I've done it. I've been there and done it all. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, no, it's some amazing delights. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yes, in short. The only thing I haven't touched yet, and I'm not that keen to touch, is certain kinds of sushi, uncooked Japanese food. But that's doubtless because I ignorance and rather than anything else. That this for me is my final hurdle is Japanese food.
All right, we'll ask the audience to make dua that you're able to overcome this hurdle. You're a man. You're the truly international man, mashallah.
I've still got a long way to go before I can truly embrace all the world's cuisines, but I'm not there yet.
Not open to sushi yet. Anyways, so you're in your 40s and you've decided to convert to Islam. How did that impact? Because you've talked about the things. Just a quick question: was there anything in terms of like a major hurdle for you had to reconcile, or no? Alhamdulillah, you dealt with them.
Oh yeah, no, there were issues, absolutely. As there were in my initial counter of the Bible, because the Bible is not a product of Western secular liberal thought, and neither is the Quran. So it does speak about the role of men and women, for example, and the Hadith as well. That there are certain teachings which are not acceptable at all in the West, which I had to then deal with. And it wasn't that difficult to understand them, to be honest. There are some excellent resources these days produced by, for example, Professor Jonathan Brown.
Yes.
At Georgetown University, his book, Misquoting Muhammad, and he's got some YouTube videos, dealing with, Surah 434, for and other issues to do with Islam and slavery. He's written a marvelous book, which I really recommend, called that. I would show you a copy, but I can't find it. So these issues where there are the age of Aisha became an issue later on once I discovered it was an issue. But then that was fairly easy to deal with as well because of my biblical background. Because the age of Aisha issue is not an issue if you understand the biblical practices,
referring to the age of Rebecca, right? The classical
puberty and so on. This is simply not an issue. If you condemn Muhammad, you're going to condemn Joseph, wife of Mary, for having Jesus. I mean, and other children by Mary.
Also,
because
human history. Just human history. My grandparents.
A lot of these problems are solved. Nearly all of them are solved once you realize that we are bringing to any text a set of assumptions that are often quite recent assumptions that come from a Western secular liberal point of view. And once you realize that that is a particular set of assumptions which are not shared by most of mankind, certainly not historically, then one can actually learn to see things differently and not be captive to a particular European recent kind of view about the age of consent or marriage or anything really. So it's just a question of liberating oneself from that box and just be able to think more intelligently even about texts. And the problems disappear then, to be honest. I don't have a problem with, there's nothing really is a problem in that sense. There's a challenge. I mean, there's a lot in the Quran I find challenging because of my own inadequacies, my own limitations, that's for sure. But in terms of intellectual problems, there aren't any.
Like,
Really.
so it was more of a Eurocentric sort of presentism that you were dealing with, right? Where you were trying to, it's an instinct. It's not anything wrong with you, by the way. Growing up as a Muslim in South Asia with an English speaking education, you do end up with these sorts of, it's universal now because of the internet, because of this post-colonial sort of economic project where we're all looking to the West for economic cues and political and social cues as well. So it's completely natural and universal, and I don't think you should feel any particularly extra.
But once we realize the historical relativity of these assumptions, the assumptions didn't exist 100 years ago, and that how thoroughly brainwashed we are to believe they are natural and normal. And there's the whole idea of things we just take for granted, like teenagehood. Teenagehood didn't exist 100 years ago. There were no such things as teenagers. This was invented in America in the 1960s. I mean, seriously, it didn't exist. No one was a teenager. You went from being a child to being an adult overnight. You simply became an adult.
About the British Empire, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a sepoy in the British Army when he was 14. The Royal British, and he was married to my grandfather. My maternal grandfather had two wives. His first wife was 10 when he got married to her, and his second wife, which is my grandmother, was 11. And he was serving in the British Army, and he eventually joined the officer class, and he oversaw the partition of Pakistan and India. So just 60, 70 years ago, this is not the case in South Asia.
But most traditional societies in history, including the biblical period, are like that. And it's only if we privilege European, Western, white outlooks that there's a problem. But we have to ask yourself, why should we privilege that? Since when has that been the center of the universe? Since when has that been
the font of all wisdom? It's a materialist sort of argument about the material successes of industrial Europe, and that's sort of superimposed and as being right or true and virtuous because there was. And the truth of it is that they perfected militarism and mercantilism, which are the two sort of leading. And unfortunately, you'll find, I don't know about you've had this experience yet, but even in the Muslim world, you'll find a lot of very decent Muslim folk, analyzing the world through this materialist sort of lens where the military might of the Western European sort of military machine is viewed as the objective source of truth. And it's a very unfortunate experience, and people like you, inshallah, should help reimagine and reshape this whole paradigm, even for Muslims, even for generational Muslims. You're a real asset, mashallah, Paul. So you reconcile these things and then you take your shahada. Was there a particular community of Muslims that you dealt with? South Asians, Arabs, Turks? Where did you take your shahada?
I didn't reconcile them before I said my shahada. That came after my shahada because I wasn't fully aware of everything before my shahada. It was a journey. So it was as a Muslim I then because I heard about things already in the internet or Speaker's Corner or whatever. So it was always a journey. Oh, there's this hadith, there's this verse, how to understand that. So I hadn't exhausted all the possible challenges or that I needed to look at before I said the child. No. It was ongoing journey, and it still is an ongoing journey. How to understand the attributes of God and so on. And these are profound questions, which are challenging, but they're not. They don't threaten faith, but they are. Anyway, without going into all of that.
They're not.
Sorry, your question. Could you just remind me?
Was there a particular, ethnic community of Muslims, immigrant community that you? Where did you take your shahada? Was it a Desi masjid? Was it an Arab mosque?
It was at Regent's Park
Did they give you
Mosque.
dates? Did they give you South Asian sweetmeats? What did they force down on you?
What did they force down my throat? Is that what normally happens? I didn't know that. No, I wasn't forced to do anything really. No, I said it. I said the shahada in the Imam's office at Regent's Park Mosque here in London, and I think I definitely then identified as a Sufi Muslim. I mentioned Guy Eaton. He was definitely a Sufi, and that's a lot of people become well, it varies, but a lot of British people become Muslims, become Salafi.
They do.
I didn't, absolutely not. And I was quite anti-Salafi, actually, not through any particular great understanding or knowledge of Salafism.
Welcome to the club, brother.
Well, yeah, but because I picked up that attitude from Muslim friends who were anti-Salafi and Sufi in their sympathies, and I was that way for a long time. That has changed, so you might not want to shake my hand quite so enthusiastic. I got to know a couple of Sufi Salafi brothers here in London, who really, really helped me at a very difficult time in my Islamic faith about 4 or 5 years ago now, and saved my faith because I went through a crisis, and which I'm not going to go into now, and they completely changed my understanding of Salafism, the Athari Creed, etc., etc. So I became and still remain very respectful of Salafism at its best. I mean, I'm not saying every Salafi is good or right. At all, but far from it. But at its best, it is something that I look to and respect enormously. That doesn't mean I'm anti-Sufi. I'm not. I also a Sufism that operates within the divine law, that doesn't transgress the divine law, is perfectly good. So I'm not anti. Some Salafis have a knee-jerk anti-Sufi view, and I don't have that. I think there are good Sufism as a spectrum. There are different kinds of Sufi practices. Some are clearly unacceptable Islamically. But the idea of self-purification, tasawwuf, is perfectly good. It's there in, the Quran and the Sunnah. It's there in the practice of the Sahaba. Of course, that's essential. But so it's complicated. So I'm not. And I'm not also an uncritical. The whole thing about the view of governments and whether or not we can criticize.
No.
But I'm not going to go there in this podcast, by the way. But these are highly controversial. But I am now much more pro-Salafi, and my own Aqidah is Athari. So I've switched. But it's all very complicated, and it's all very contentious. And I know people like to argue about it.
I think it's a waste of time. I think an academic approach is much better. You have the good sense to appreciate the good things in the Sufi tradition as well as in the Salafi tradition, because the Salafi tradition has been very effective in shaping the Muslim identity in Europe and in America in the past 50, 60 odd years. And it's been helpful for thousands, if not millions of people in recent years. And it has its role in the mosaic that is the Islamic society. And I think that
I think so. Yeah. I think there's a lot to learn. There's an awful lot of prejudice against Salafis. Some of it I can understand why. There are some Salafis who really, really don't help their position at all, and are frankly embarrassing. But they're not the best of them. And I know some excellent Salafi brothers here, as I say. And and that's great. I have huge respect for their way they think. But I also don't necessarily follow everything they say. They may be I'm not going to mention names. There's some prominent Muslim scholars here in the UK, very distinguished scholars, and they wouldn't even listen to one particular scholar because he is a Sufi. And I'm thinking, I can see why you don't want to listen. But he says an awful lot of stuff which is really, really helpful about the modern world, about philosophy, about history. So we can take what is good, surely, and ignore the rest if we want to. We don't have to just kind of boycott him.
This is my experience with Salafism, and considering that I grew up in a post 9/11 sort of reality in Pakistan, with a lot of Salafi influence coming in from the Saudi-backed sort of madrasa system, is that they are a bit quixotic in their, like, they're very Don Quixote-like, where they're always finding and fighting windmills. There is that element of.
There can be, but a lot of Sufis, I've seen Sufis, a lot of Sufis behaving like that, being very, very sectarian. I mean, Sufis can be even worse. And without getting into all the detail, I think that there is a problem there. But I just wish there was more understanding of all our different groups, because there is good in all of them. There's good in Sufism, as I say, understood within the divine law without transgressing it. And there's good in Salafism as well. The Aqidah, I mentioned, the great emphasis on the Quran and Sunnah as understood by the Sahaba is really, that's just Sunni Islam, obviously, but there's a great stress on that. and so on. This is really positive.
I would be remiss to say that Salafi ideas do not influence the modern Muslim like myself. The way we view these things, and the Athari Aqidah specifically, and the sort of the very orthodox Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat sort of ideas. I think a reconciliation will happen very soon, inshallah. As we see, I think the UK is very ripe for this. We've been seeing it in Pakistan as well, alhamdulillah, that the across the Sunni spectrum, you have increased cooperation and coordination, and a celebration of common sort of ideals, and looking forward. There is an acceptance of that there is something bigger outside of us that is a much larger threat to the nation of Islam and to the sanctity of our communities in the Muslim world as well as in Europe. And I think you would be one of those voices, inshallah, to champion this sort of balance. And I've heard you're a big Ibn Taymiyyah rahimullah fan. You're a big,
Oh yes, no.
yeah.
That didn't come as a sectarian thing. Oh, you've got to like Ibn.
No.
No. I remember actually. My main introduction, I remember I invited a scholar onto blogging theology, the author of this book, Professor Carl Sharif El-Tubki. He taught at Yale and is now a professor at Brandeis University in America, one of the Ivy League universities. And I invited him on to talk about Ibn Taymiyyah. And he said, yeah, I'll come on, Paul, but I want you to read my doctorate first. And I'm thinking, what? So he sent me his doctorate, which is actually this book, Ibn Taymiyyah on Reason and Revelation, which I then read. And I was really bowled over by the extraordinary genius, as I see it anyway, of Ibn Taymiyyah.
I agree.
He was a polymath in so many areas, whether it hadith studies or the Quran, of course, exegesis, or kalam or Sufism. He spoke with great knowledge. I'm not saying he's perfect, but he and also his own personal courage when he was, he confronted the Mughal ruler who had basically kidnapped and taken Christian and other people as prisoners, and he basically risked his life in their defense, saying, "Look, release these people."
Which is, as you would know, Paul, the greatest jihad, to speak the truth to an unjust ruler.
And he did that, and he didn't have to do that, and he did that, and he was a scholar who showed immense personal courage in the face of danger for the sake of other people.
I was with some brothers, and they mentioned that even in battle, that there's some narrations that a lot of karamat happened when he was leading by his hand, yani a lot of miraculous events happened in the actual field of battle as well. Considering that he was not a military man, I think that Allah blessed him in that way.
Exactly, and he used to be. I think there are some Salafi brothers who misunderstand him, who may profess to follow him, but perhaps don't understand quite what he said, whether it be towards Sufism or the use of kalam arguments, rationality, arguing, which he did allow in certain circumstances. If you're arguing with people, non-Muslims, who only will engage with you in that way, you can use philosophical arguments, kalam type arguments, the argument for contingency, the ontological argument, and so on. So there is a nuance there which is sometimes lost, and also towards Sufism, he wasn't against all Sufism, only those aspects, the practices that transgress the law. So I was generally impressed, and he reminded me when I was a Christian of my encounter with people like St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. And I mentioned those names, not that they're in any way, I'm not saying Thomas Aquinas, obviously these are Kafir, these are Christians, but I mention it because these two Christian thinkers were geniuses as well. And it's such a pleasure to encounter great minds that have changed human history in terms of their influence on people. Because Augustine and Aquinas did change history for all sorts of reasons. And Ibn Taymiyyah is in the same class of elite in humankind. His influence is enduring, it's continuing, and it's increasing because of the sheer magnitude of his thought and his great insights into Islam and the law and so on. I'm not saying we should be slavishly following him. I'm just saying he is a great Islamic scholar, one of the greatest.
Beautifully put. You don't need to provide a caveat to your words. That was beautifully put, mashallah.
I'm not saying he's the only one either. I'm far from saying Al-Ghazali doesn't have anything to say as well. He's also a genius at that same level, Al-Ghazali, actually. But I'm not saying they're all therefore the same, but I'm saying it was great as of me as a new Muslim to discover these great colossus of human of spirituality and intellectual theological insight, and so that's why I'm definitely a fan of Ibn Taymiyyah, but not just him. And it's great. I'm always trying to promote his work without doing it too much because
have you interviewed Dr. Awamir Anjum? And he wrote a book as well, the Taymiyyah moment. Oh, you have it. You have it.
Yeah, I've got it behind me. Yeah, I literally interviewed him yesterday. The video's yet to go up. Yeah, I've interviewed him. He's a friend of mine, and his PhD, which is where did I put it? It's here somewhere behind me.
It's fine. We can put it up in post.
No, I certainly have read his work as well, and he I've met Andrew, a professor at Toledo University in America, is a great writer and speaker about another thing that I'm quite passionate about, and that's the Caliphate and the Caliph, and the importance of that institution, that Islamic institution in the modern world. So he's founded the Ummatics Institute, Vermeer has, and he's done some incredible academic work on the Caliphate, its history in different periods, and yesterday, the video's yet to go up. He gave a talk on the Constitution of Medina, the so-called Constitution of Medina, the Constitution inverted commas, because anyway, I won't go into that. But
yes,
so he talked about the history of the text, its authenticity, its interpretation, and the next video we're going to be doing, inshallah, in a couple of weeks is going to be about the contemporary reception of that and how we understand that important text in the modern world. So, yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Brother Paul, you find yourself in this strange position of being a representative of a tradition that is maybe not native, and I'm using air quotations for that, native to you or your people, but you find yourself being a leading representative for it in the 21st century, post 7th of October. You have people like Tommy Robinson, with Zionist money masquerading around the UK, rallying up people to attack masajid and the Muslim community at large. Where do you find yourself? Where do you position yourself? Where do you see allies? Where do you see who to oppose? And how do you see going forward this movement, considering that you find the position of the Caliphate and the institution of the Caliphate to be central to all of this? The sort of the amnesia that the Muslim world faces, because of which we unfortunately we have a lot of serious problems in the Muslim world as well as in the West. But given all of this context, where do you position yourself? How do you manage this, and how do you see your podcast going forward, and how do you plan all of this?
Gosh, there's lots and lots of issues there. I think the West at the moment, perhaps a little bit understandably, although not really, has demonized this whole thing of the Caliphate because of the so-called Islamic State. That this group that still exists apparently in Syria or wherever, in parts of the Levant. But the Caliphate, if I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is a central Sunni concept. It's all schools see it as really important. Most of them see it as necessary for the functioning of the Ummah. It's an Ummah-wide political institution, and a number of key aspects of the Sharia can't operate without it. Collecting zakat, for example, is supposed to be done by the Caliph, and there are many other things as well. So the Ummah needs rulership. It needs its own rulership. It doesn't need to be ruled from Washington or Downing Street or anywhere else. It needs to be ruled by a successor to the Prophet. So he's not a prophet, so he's not like especially holy man, but he represents, I suppose, the political authority that the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, represented. But obviously he's not a prophet, so he doesn't have that spiritual status at all. But so he doesn't have to be perfect. But so he's a unifying figure, and the Ummah really badly needs it. And I think the West will have to learn, in my view, that what the peace with the Muslim world is really only going to be possible when the Muslim world itself is secure, when it is at peace with itself, when it's properly represented in government, and when it's not constantly being attacked by the West and occupied and genocide supported amongst, it is actually a good thing for the West if Muslims are given just rulership, and not to fear it. Because at the moment, in supporting countless statelets, which were mostly created by Britain anyway in the 19th century, now we get these different groups, of tiny little Muslim countries, little nations based on a kind of European nation state model, which there's not been in the Muslim world. We had the Ottoman Empire for centuries, where you could travel from, I don't know, Damascus to, you could study in Damascus, and you could go and do further studies in Cairo, and then you could go further to Baghdad or wherever. And you weren't going to different countries with visas like you have to now. You literally just travel. It was all one empire. And so in that sense, Muslims were much better off then than they are now. I've got a Muslim friend of mine who, is Egyptian. He needs to get a visa to go to Turkey, for example. Yes. I don't need a visa to go to Turkey, by the way, or Egypt. It's because I'm British, but he needs a visa just to go from one Muslim country to another. How absurd! How absurd is that? 100 years ago, he wouldn't need a visa at all. He could simply go all over the place and study without any restrictions on his movement. So we've gone backwards, and we need a different polity that represents Muslim interests and not the interests of Washington or NATO or whatever other hegemonic power is bearing down on us at the moment. And we also need a shield to defend ourselves. Look what's happening at the moment. We have a genocide of Muslims going on, and we're seemingly no one is doing. I don't want to get, I'm not in a blame game, right, but we shouldn't be in this position. We should not be in this position. We should be able to defend Muslims and others from injustice, from killing, and we're not doing that. Maybe we can't, maybe we can. That's another debate.
The practical infeasibility is a separate thing. In the state that we're in.
And I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Your
is it back now?
Your audio is back now. Sorry, I couldn't hear.
It's the practical infeasibility of us being unable to defend the people in Gaza is a separate thing. What you're talking about, without doing the blame game, is that we're divided up into these alien sort of nation state, ethnic or geographical groups. The classical example would be that we in Pakistan could go all the way up to Bukhara in Uzbekistan, but now a British Durand line. You know what the Durand line is between Pakistan and Afghanistan? It was made by a British officer. It's called the Durand line. It's an arbitrary. It does not make sense geographically. It does not make sense ethnically. So the Pashtun people are split between the Pakistani side of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is the province, and Afghanistan, and also Balochistan as well. So these two regions have never historically, for thousands of years, have never been separated. But now an arbitrary line has been made. Initially, the line was semi-porous, but now with the war on terror, the Americans made us build a barbed sort of fence across the line, which is a huge expanse, by the way. It's physically impossible to cover the whole thing. But we have this sort of fake sort of border. It's one of the biggest hot points on earth for smuggling, because these are historical routes where, so the sheep herders would come down from Central Asia all the way into Pakistan and North India. And that was the route for the summers and the winters. And it's been that for 4,000, 3,000, however many odd years. But now with the nation state, so it's not just a matter of is Egypt or Jordan or whoever, are they capable of doing something? It's also about, is it even their role to do anything? Because the way the nation state is formed, you are immediately concerned with your, citizenry within this arbitrary boundary.
And that's not Islamic. We're supposed to be thinking of the whole Ummah, the 2 billion. We're not supposed to be thinking about British Muslims or Iraqi Muslims or Egypt. That's not how it's supposed to be. We're not supposed to be divided in that way. I'm not saying you can't be Egyptian or anything like that. But in terms of political division. It's very harmful, and because we're divided, then we can individually, form alliances and dependencies on the United States or Britain or whatever, and so the whole thing just gets more fractured. And I'm not too worried, to be honest. I mean, there is an amazing hadith, I'm sure you know, in Bukhari and Muslim, about this, that there will be a time when there will be no rulership, which is now, and then it will return, and it will return in God's good time, inshallah, in our lifetimes. It will. It's a prophecy about it. It's a genuine prophecy. It will come back.
Caliphate in the way of the prophethood. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be good to be very nice to see it come back, because it's the number one thing we need on a political level is unity and just governorship based on Islam, not on secular liberalism or what America thinks is in our interests or the IMF or the UN. No, on Islam, and we need that really a lot actually. And I keep on stressing this. It's something the West just doesn't get. Is that this will make for a peaceful world, a happier world, because if Muslims are at peace and not under attack and threat and divided, then there will be a confidence, a generosity about the Ummah, which at the moment it doesn't have so much because it is under threat so much. And if we're not under threat and we can confidently govern ourselves, then we will be a much more attractive place for everyone. Non-Muslims too will want to come and live in the Muslim world, because it will be secure and happy and wholesome, and it will be under the guidance of God's law rather than all the other man-made institutions which are doing such damage to our environment, to our families, to our economies, and such. So I think it's going to be a win-win situation ultimately. And I think we have the prophetic assurance that it will come back. So it's just, I hope, it doesn't mean we shouldn't we should need to work for it. But I think, inshallah, it will happen sooner rather than later.
Inshallah, I think I hope we can see it in our own lives. So you have this whole case for the Caliphate and how it would be a win-win for the Western world as well as the Muslim world.
Yeah,
and how do you position yourself in the UK, being that you enjoy a certain amount of privilege being in the Western world? Yani, for example, uninterrupted internet, just without screen freezes.
Yeah.
Like, what you're doing great work already, mashallah. But how do you align yourself with with Christian groups or with liberal groups, and on what issues do you see yourself working together with each other, and what do you think is the way forward for somebody who's listening to this, a young person in the Muslim world or the Western world? Yani, what would your advice?
Well, we've I think it's now generally acknowledged amongst Muslim leaders in Britain and in the United States that we've made some mistakes in this regard in the last decade or so. So what do I mean? Without mentioning individuals' names, but they're well known, but it's not an individual thing. But there were prominent Muslim leaders here, certainly here and in the US, who saw alliances with left-wing organizations and causes, often finding themselves having to downplay certain Islamic teaching, say on marriage or LGBT, for example, so as not to offend certain political parties we were in alliance with. And I can understand why people did this immediately after 9/11, when Muslims were in the West were under a lot of pressure. I know pressure everywhere, but we were surveyed, we were criticized, we were often locked up or arrested, or and so we sought for allies who could help protect us, and that was the left. So yeah, I can see why we perhaps naively formed alliances with them. But what this has meant, particularly since the bizarre sort of emergence of identity politics and the whole trans thing and all that, is that we were expected to support that agenda, and some of us did. They maybe not believing in it, but we felt we had to. Some political leaders, like I mentioned one, Hamza Yusuf in America, in Scotland, not the American sheikh. I mean, the Scottish politician, leader of the Scottish National Party. I mentioned him; he's no longer in power, and what I'm saying about him is just public record. But he was a Muslim, calls himself a Muslim, who really uncritically supported the whole LGBT agenda very, very enthusiastically. It was appalling to see. What were his motives? I don't know, but we really can't be doing that anymore. And I think Muslim leaders, whether it be Yaqeen Institute or other places, have realized the mistakes were made and are now saying we need to be independent. We're not of the right politically or the left. We are Muslims. Okay. So we will form ad hoc alliances, perhaps, with individuals or groups based on specific issues. So we'll be there with pro-Palestinian groups who are speaking out against the genocide in Gaza. Absolutely. But it doesn't mean we sign up to, say, Marxism or socialism or other kind of dunya-based fantasies, because we're not that. We're Muslims. And same with the right. A lot of the right, conservative right, is very good in its support of the traditional family. They're anti-abortion, they're pro-family, they could be pro-healthy values in many areas. But we're not going to sign up with them with other things. If they're white nationalists, for example, or they're just nationalists, or whatever, or race or Islamophobes, obviously. So I think we just need to be more independent, more discerning, and not just naively hook up with political causes that will insist we pay a price and we have to deny our Islam. We can't deny our Islam. And that's often what has happened. It's certainly happened in the UK. I mentioned Hamza Yusuf, and in America too, without mentioning names there. And they've learnt mistakes. They publicly acknowledge that. And that's great. So I think, that's the way forward. Independence rather than getting in bed with all these bizarre organizations just because, say, they support the Palestinians. I think we need to be much more clear about our views and not cover them up because we don't want to lose friends. That would be my harsh view.
Right. We should be willing to risk hurting people's sensibilities when it comes to the principles of Islam and the injunctions of the Sharia. And I think
we must stand up for our. We must not compromise. Islam is that's the way of other faiths. Christianity is completely compromised now. Any church in the West is now compromised. That they will support all sorts of secular movements which have nothing to do with the Bible, can go completely against the Torah, what Jesus taught, what the New Testament teaches, and they'll happily do that. They've completely given up. They're now basically secular humanist organizations with a thin veneer of Christianity on top. But what they really care about are secular, humanistic kind of causes. So they'll be very, very hot on, on a very politically correct thing. But when it comes to, say, fornication, which is a serious sin in the New Testament, they'll never say anything about it at all. It's just never completely silent, even though it's a serious sin. And this is obviously absurd. So Islam has to have the balance again and not follow the Christians and Jews down that hole, which unfortunately there is hadith about that as well.
No, there's a really fascinating point that we also interviewed Brother Ovami Ranjum, and he mentioned two things that were really fascinating. I think that the internet and the English language has allowed the Ummah to interact with each other in a way that maybe we did not, a few centuries ago. Because, the ability for us to communicate right now, for example. And I think for you, what it is in the Americas specifically, I think the Muslim community was slightly more guilty of capitulating to sort of secular ideals. Yeah, and I think the reason is Brother Paul, geographically, I think they also felt very isolated. I mean, who's going to take the 15-hour flight from, Pakistan to America to explain to them that, that maybe guys, you have this all wrong. And on the other, and I think on top of that, I think America has a more tough sort of militaristic attitude, and they were cracking down very seriously, and the threat of the violence was more real and apparent. I think European society is slightly more, the legal atmosphere is more comfortable, and there are more opportunities. And I also suspect there's an anthropological reason that the European Muslim diaspora from the Muslim world has been mostly working class. And in the Americas, you've had sort of the upper class slightly more cosmopolitan, people with maybe weaker stomachs, yani going from the Muslim world into the Americas, and maybe they're easier to browbeat and beat into submission. I also think that now with the internet and the English language and platforms like yours, inshallah, I think an increased dialogue between Western Muslims and traditionally yani Muslims from the Muslim territories, this
Yeah,
would
absolutely.
be very effective in allowing the Western Muslims to be cognizant of the problems back home, as well as of yani back home in the spiritual sense, as well as the problems at home in the physical, more immediate sense in the West. And I think that
Mhm.
this cross, because none of these political issues were isolated. Yani 9/11 and the war on terror, because there's a thing in Afghanistan and in Iraq, right? And then that translates in for the Western Muslims in one way, and the Muslims in the Muslim world in another way. I'll give you an example. Like you were talking about the LGBT stuff, we have all the marches as well in the Muslim world. They happen under the guise of women's rights or one thing or the other. We have the same NGO, we call it the NGO class, the non-government organization. So it's the same superstructure, think tanks, lobby groups, NGOs. There's a dispensation of money or grants. There's charities that's something benign like sanitary pads for women in wherever in the south of Punjab somewhere. But then slowly they have a school now. There's liberal arts, and we're having study circles about Marxism or about a queer
Yeah.
identity or what have you. So if there will be an increased communication between the Western Muslims, because they're sort of the tip of the spear for the Muslim world, I think that would be helpful for redoubling the iman as well as the political efforts for both Muslims at home as well as Muslims abroad. Have you?
No, I agree. Sorry.
Sorry, please. I'm sorry. I'm ranting and
No,
raving.
I agree. I agree with you. And because of technology, internet, and ease of travel, it mostly this is becoming ever more of a possibility. Yeah, building these bridges and so on. I think we're learning the lessons the hard way. You mentioned, the American Muslims being quite remote from the main body of the Ummah, which is true, but yet nevertheless they inhabit the belly of the beast, in the superpower, in the States. So they have this kind of, they're both very marginal and yet very in the heart of it, at the same time. But they're learning sometimes the hard way, some important lessons. There are some outstanding figures. You mentioned Professor Omer Andrum, who had the privilege of meeting. Outstanding scholar, very clear-sighted, extremely educated, with a good understanding of the issues facing the Ummah, and a number of other ones.
And
Now, there's a great new.
our friend Daniel,
Yeah.
who you hosted in the UK, Daniel
What
Haqiqatju,
Daniel?
Daniel Haqiqatju.
Oh yeah, 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 and many others like Imam Tom,
Tom
and
Fajini, yeah.
well, the list is very.
It's very long.
And then a young generation of scholars who are coming through, who are extremely switched on about the West as well as the Muslim world. So they're no longer suffering from this kind of, well, we're just Americans and we don't really relate to what's going on in Pakistan. These people are aware of what's going on globally. Truly global Muslims who are nevertheless Western, white Muslims sometimes, like Imam Tom. So I'm very optimistic about what's happening, actually, and often the good news is happening in the West, actually, these days. There's some fantastic institutions like the Cambridge Muslim College here in England, Zaytuna College in California, and others, where, as I say, there's a new generation of highly educated, multilingual, polymath young scholars who had the privilege of meeting some of them, who give real cause to be very optimistic about our engagement as Muslims with modernity, with the West and the hegemony of the West, and also the Muslim world. So, and English is becoming as well a language of Islam. It's becoming an Islamic language. Some original research. I was speaking to one scholar in Dallas, Texas, a few weeks ago, who's done some original research in English in Texas of all places. I think it's actually originally from Pakistan, or his parents anyway. So that's amazing. So things are happening where you might not expect them to happen.
When are we expecting the the victory tour in Pakistan? When is Paul Williams going to come and, in the belly of the spices, in the belly of the beast of the spices? When are you coming?
Uh, Gosh, that's a very poetic way of putting it. But I'm always open to. I mean, it has been. Do you know Adnan Rashid, the
Yes,
historian?
yes, of course, of course.
Of course you do. I'm just checking. He's a friend of mine.
Nice.
Obviously, he's based. I say he's based in London, but I hardly ever see him these days. He's always in traveling around
Yeah.
in Pakistan and other places. No, he has suggested to me before about a visit to Pakistan, and I think I'd love to do that. It's a part of the world I've never been to, and so I'm absolutely up for it. It's just basically the
Just
logistics
timings
and.
and logistics. We would be honored to
Well,
host you.
I'm up to it. Up
There's
to it, yeah.
there's a bunch of the religious organization that Brother Adnan and Muhammad Hijab. We had Hijab here as well. We hosted him in Lahore for a day. The religious organizations that they work with here, they all know you. They all love you. We've talked about them. I've talked about them with you, and they would be honored to host you, inshallah. You have a decent following in the universities and liberal arts colleges as well, and there's a lot of young people, and hopefully after this more young people from Pakistan will people who wouldn't necessarily consume content in English, but they have access to it. They will also be
Right.
accessing your blogging theology channel, inshallah. And there's some very one of the most enlightening ones recently was the one with the Italian professor. By the way, for me personally, I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, Sister Francesca,
Yes,
she's amazing. I mean, she's obviously a white Italian. I mentioned that. She's a
yes,
convert to Islam.
Mash.
Did her PhD in Germany, so she had to learn German. So she speaks obviously German, Italian. She speaks English perfectly, and she's a very. In Italy, she's done some extraordinary work
Exceptional.
raising education and understanding of Islam in Italy, which in many ways is so behind. I hadn't quite realized how bad it was. I mean, this is what she's saying in Italy compared to some other
Yeah,
countries like
apparently, like
Britain.
legally, we're not even a separate religious identity. Yeah,
Exactly.
she mentioned that. Yeah,
I hadn't realized that would be unthinkable here. And so it's very uneven, the West, in its engagement with Muslims and Islam. Some of it's very, very bad, like in France. France is just getting worse. Its treatment of Muslims and of people who don't subscribe to a very militant secular liberalism is shocking. It's happening in Germany now too, and in Italy. But there are bright lights, and Sister Francesca is a
definitely.
bright light. And inshallah, she will come back. I mean, we are discussing this, doing a whole series
You
of
should.
videos on BT about all sorts of things. So I'm really looking forward to the video she did just a matter of weeks ago. It's what 183,000
Yes,
views
mashallah.
already,
Yes.
something like that.
No, the fact
It's
that
going to
you
hit.
identified her and that you patronized her, provided her a platform, like I would have never heard. I've been to Italy and I never knew that Islam is not a separate religion. You couldn't even imagine it.
Yeah, I mean, it was someone else put us in touch with her. I wasn't familiar with the work in Italy, so there are several Italian Muslims now I'm in touch with. And I think we should support their work, and I think more than anything, make their work known. So talk about Muslims in Italy. Italy is a great country and has a huge, incredible history, obviously. So Muslims exist there and are, surviving and thriving. And we need to talk about their work and their struggles, not just the United States, not just Britain, but Italy, France, Germany, and the other countries in Europe as well.
I
So
think the
anyway, back to
Mediterranean.
Pakistan. So, yeah, yeah, I
No,
think Pakistan will be amazing opportunity.
we will see you in Pakistan soon, inshallah. Thank you for doing all the work that you've been doing. It's a great honor for us to be able to speak with you, and I hope that we haven't bothered you or taken too much of your time, and that we'll be able to do these more regularly whenever you have time and whenever you want to address
Inshallah.
a Pakistani audience directly, inshallah. You could do it through us. You let us know anything that you need for us to do for the sake of our brotherhood and for the sake of Islam. Brother Paul, it's been an honor. Thank you for sharing your journey, your ideas about different
Thank you
topics.
for having me on. It's been a great privilege to be on your amazing channel,
Is it?
and I'm very honored. Thank you very much for putting up with me for an hour or two. And So till next time, I guess.
Thank you. Is there anything that you would like to give a message before I stop the recording?
Not really. I mean, no. I've said more than I should anyway, probably. So I said enough. Thank you.
All right,
anyway.
everybody make dua for Brother Paul. Thank you, Jazakallah. I'm gonna pause the recording over here. And where's the thing? All right. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Paul.
Walaikum assalam.